What's going on, guys? It's your boy Beats by Ash, back at it again with another banger of a video. And today I'm going to be bringing you guys my deck profile and analysis of the Eustass Captain Kidd deck that I piloted in my locals 3v3 tournament over the weekend to a top 4 placing finish. But before we get into that, I've got a couple of things to tell you guys. Number one, in this video, I'm going to be giving away 6 packs of Tournament Pack Volume 2. If you're interested in winning that, make sure to leave a comment on this video, like the video, and be subscribed to the channel. Almost 70% of you guys are not subscribed to the channel, so make sure to press that button because it really helps me out, and I'm giving out free value like no one has ever done before. If you're interested in getting better at the game, make sure to join my Discord. I have a coaching channel as well in there if you're interested in that. Follow me over on Twitter, and without further ado, let's get into the goo. So the way that the 3v3 tournament works is essentially each person on your team is playing their own best of one game. And when doing this, each of your teammates can only use one color. They can't share the same color. So what that means is if my teammate is playing Law, then I can't play a deck that's using red or green. And for that reason, I made my friend not play Law because he's a one-dimensional player and I wanted to play one of the 2 colors. Let's go. But besides that, I think it makes for a very different metagame because now you have to make your deck to compete with a variety of decks rather than in the current state of the meta. I would argue there's 3 viable red decks, potentially 4, depending on what way you look at it. One of my biggest insights was only one person on the opposing team could be playing red. I think there's a lot of good decks that could be better if red wasn't so oppressive. And by mitigating the chance to go up against that person, it can make your deck a lot better. And for that same reason, I chose not to play blue at this tournament. Number one, because I wanted to have fun, because it's not all about winning, and this is a special event to experience. But number two, because I think that blue is really good against the current meta. Whereas if I can only play against one red person, I'm going to go against a lot of matchups that are either 50-50 or the other person is going to be slightly favored. And at that point, I think there are just better options for me to run. And that's why I decided to go with Eustass Captain Kidd. Another thing about this type of tournament is that you can communicate among your teammates to discuss plays, which I know that at some treasure cups in that side event, you were not allowed to talk to your teammates, which I think is kind of stupid because at that point, why are you even playing a 3v3? Because that makes it a lot more fun because then you're actually like working hand in hand with your team and you can explore certain strategies. Like one of my friends, he basically just explained like, okay, well, what if the middle person goes red? And that way your game ends super fast. So that way you can start helping the other people, regardless of whether you win or lose your match. And I thought that was a very interesting insight. I think there's a lot of different combinations that you can think about that can make it super fun. Highly recommend you talk to your guys' locals about doing one of these because you could have fun doing this too, and it really brings a lot of people together. All right, guys, so this is what I call the value engine. All of these cards allow you to gain card advantage, and in order to win with this deck, you need to have a value engine on board, and you need to be able to defend it because that's what's going to allow you to out-resource the other person, and I think that's the whole game plan of this deck. So we have 4 Bonnie, 4 Momonosuke, and 4 Raizo. One of the biggest benefits of playing this deck is that you can effectively use 4 Bonnie and 4 Momonosuke, I would say in a better utility than playing Kinemon, because I think when you play Kinemon, your deck gets tied up with a lot of Wano Country slots to where it's hard to say that you should be playing 4 Jewelry Bonnie if you're playing that leader. And I think that was really nice with this leader because it just made me feel like I had a higher chance to play the game. And in a best of 1 game, I think that's very important. That's why it was such a good deck in set 1. Now I'm going to talk about the defensive cards. So we're playing 4 Beige, standard, 4 Killer, also standard. And then I play 2 Shachi and 2 of the new card, Nekomamushi. You're going to see in this profile that most of these cards are from set 1, but this is one of the new additions to the deck, and I thought about cutting one of these, but I just realized it just creates so much more versatility to your searches, because previously in set 1, you couldn't search for a defensive option off of your Momonosuke. And I think that in a best of 1 scenario, and in general with the way that searchers work in this game, since the game is not super consistent, it's highly valuable to have the most number of options that are actually of that upper grade card quality as you can, because the more options you have, the more lines you have available, and the more opportunities you have to change the game. So I really like this card, and I think that it really aligns with what you're trying to do, because it makes it to where if you have an 8-drop Captain Kidd and you don't have a Bonnie, that you could still look for a blocker, which then allows you to delay the game and do what your deck is trying to do. And then in terms of Shachi, he just has a 1K counter, and he also has that 4K stat line. I think it's also very important to note that you need to be able to play down a blocker with your Captain Kidd ability most of the time if you're at a low health total. And I think that having 4 additional cards that you can drop down at that stat line are amazing. And all of these cards are also cards you can summon off of your Law for a +1, because as you can tell, we do not run Okiku. And so being able to get that incremental Dawn advantage via blockers that are higher cost and demand a modifier as well as a removal are amazing, because pretty much everybody in this meta has a Vista effect. And demanding an additional card via a modifier makes it to where they don't just get a +1 on you. And then we have 4 copies of Trafalgar Law. You know, I mean, it's the best card in the deck. I honestly just don't see how you can play green without 4 Law. The way that you're going to win the game is by, you know, putting down a 1-cost unit and then using this card to gain that advantage via returning it and putting down a 3-cost unit. In addition to that, it's one of the few cards that allows us to guarantee protection on our value engine, because we can search off of our Bonnie or our Momonosuke, then return it back to our hands, which is very huge because that aligns with exactly what we're trying to do. It has a huge effect on our deck archetype, and I love that. And then I played 3 copies of Punk Gibson to round out the defensive cards. So that's going to bring us to a total of 16 blockers, 3 Punk Gibsons. We have 19 total defensive cards. You could run a 4th Punk Gibson. I just felt like I wanted to add another utility option to the deck, because I felt like Punk Gibson, for me, if I didn't trigger it, I think it was just more applicable in the late game when I already have a Eustass Captain Kidd on board, and seeing it early just made me feel like it could have been any other card, because I just wanted to discard it off of my leader. But at the end of the day, it's one of those cards that's at that high quality requirement and a supernova. And when you get down to, you know, the nitty gritty of meeting your base numbers to have the highest percentage chance to search with each engine, it's almost like you have to include this one, because there's like not anything that's also on that stat line. And not to mention, I am going second with this build in almost every matchup. So we don't have other cards that are high value to add off of that, for the reason that like the 7-drop Kidd just isn't as applicable with our curve 9 out of 10 times. And it's like kind of slow in a race-based meta. All right, so that's going to be all for the defensive cards. And now I'm going to go into the rest engine. So, you know, standard, 4 Nekomamushi, 4 Izo. And then this is just a synonymous engine, so I'm just going to include it too. 4 of Scratchman. You know, I mean, he's just a 2K, not going to talk about it much. You need to have 8 2Ks in the deck, but because we have such a high number of defensive cards, you can get around like not having 10 to 12 2Ks. And I really enjoy that about this deck. Now into the way that you win, I consider these the win conditions of the deck. So standard, 4 Eustass Captain Kidd. In set 1, we played 3 Kidd. I think now you can't get away with anything less than 4. And the reason being is that this goes hand in hand with why people stopped playing the deck. It's because you can somewhat easily respond to this card, whereas in OPO1, it was just fucking broken. Like, it was just oppressive, and like the other guy just had to high roll and just open Otama Pistol or double Otama Bounce with his Law. And, you know, now we just have so many other cards. We have the 9-drop Whitebeard, which is played in almost every red deck, and that card inherently outs this card if you don't have additional setup. So I think having 4 is just necessary, because when you can replace it, you were a lot less reliant on keeping the first one on board. And I think at a certain point, people just started undervaluing how oppressive this actually is because number one, people are less experienced with answering the card in the current meta, so they're not going to play into it as efficiently as they could. Number two, they think that they've got it under wraps because they removed the first one and people, typically didn't play 4 in OPO 1. But the way that the deck is now, I found that you can just cycle through your deck multiple times super consistently because you're just looking to stall out the game. And I think that very much well aligns with the way that this deck plays into the current meta. Versus Kinemon, they have almost no direct answers to the 8-drop kid. If you don't know, if you use 7 searches and none of them fail, then you're going to get all the way through 1 rotation of your deck. And that's important to keep note of in this deck because that can give you information on what is in your life. That can tell you how close you are to reaching a win condition because there's certain cards in the deck that you need to win certain matchups. And in general, that's just good information to have. And that's what I like about this deck because it teaches you to master that mechanic. I think that if you master that mechanic via this deck, that translates very well into you going into Law, because in Law, that becomes even more of an important concept because they have even more searchers than us. So I think that's just something really important to note for people wanting to get into these more complex decks. I think this is a very good deck to try where you're going to not do very well in the beginning, but every time you play, if you are actually being honest with yourself, you can understand what you did wrong and you can make a better decision. Now, that may not have won you the game, but there was another line that could have been better or played around different circumstances that were more applicable in that game stating. And I really like that about this deck. Usually the way that I win is I just don't attack the other guy's life total in most matchups and just play for board. And that can allow you to out-resource people very quickly because you have so many more value engines than other people. Final additions to the deck, I play 2 copies of the way that you actually kill people, this Yamato, and then 1 copy of the 4-drop Yamato. Now, I cannot say enough about the 5-cost Yamato. This card outperformed everything that I thought you could do with it. In set 1, in Kid, and as well in Kinemon in set 2, I've just really felt like this card is very strong, but my problem with it is that it has a small window of whenever it's going to be super impactful. Like in the Kinemon deck, I feel like if you don't play it on curve, it has such a high depreciating value that it's almost just not worth playing. But in this deck, what I found that's different than in set 1 is the reason you use Yamato is because you don't want it in the early game, or even the mid game. If you have it in hand, then maybe you could play it on curve versus someone like blue or black, somewhere where like if the guy doesn't have an answer to it, then you might be able to just cheese them. So there are just situations where like when it hits, but in terms of actually searching, you don't need to search for it in the early to mid game. And I would argue that it's not actually beneficial to do so. You want to search for this after you're in the late game in the matchups where you need to break a stalemate. So previously in set 1, we had a lot of Eustass Kid mirror matches, and I think what allowed you to break the stalemate was having that 7-drop kid, having that Basil Hawkins. I like to break it down to what you need to win the game in Eustass Kid is you need, number 1, your 8-drop. Number 2, you need a value engine. And number 3, you need 2 to 3 blockers. Now, when you have the Yamato, you get into a situation where you can break the stalemate because the other guy might have an equal amount of blockers or he's not tapping his characters, so you can't play for board because we only play that 1 4-drop Yamato. I just wanted to add more versatility to my Momonosuke because once again, I can't stress enough, adding more options creates more lines wins you more games. But the Yamato is just applicable in every single matchup except Whitebeard. Now the problem with that is in the US, Whitebeard is super prevalent. So if you wanted to go down to 1 Yamato, 5-drop that is, I could understand that. Like you could go into like an X-Drake, and that's what I was thinking about doing after this tournament. I definitely want to try it because I think it's worth noting that you have one 4-cost Yamato, one X-Drake, and one 5-cost Yamato. It just gives you more versatility to what you can do. And because I can already comfortably say that we're going to look through our deck through its entirety at least one cycle in the game, probably multiple cycles, unless you just get a really easy win because the guy isn't good at managing his resources. You're going to see every card in your deck, and you're going to know how far you are away from it. Now, the problem with that is, when the Yamato is super applicable in the matchup for you to close out the game, what if it's your last life card or your second to last life card, and, you know, you can't take it because the guy's playing a deck where he has a lot of burst potential. Maybe he has an 8-cost Odin on the board, and the 5-drop Yamato is insane in that matchup. That's why, like, the 2 came in super clutch. Also, you could consider cutting down one of the Neko Namushi blockers in exchange for adding that X-Drake. Because that card doesn't have counter, and that is a downside to it. But at the end of the day, you could also make the same argument for Shachi, because you're replacing a card with counter for a card with counter. Those are kind of like the flex spots in the deck, and I'm giving you guys this information so that you don't just net deck me, and that you can understand what is viable and what is going to be the best optimal build for your situation. Because the entirety of this game and how successful you can be is built off of anticipation. Anticipation before you come to the tournament, what you're anticipating you're going to play against, the way you're anticipating the other person will play, and those decisions that you make before you show up are going to change everything for you, especially because we're in a best of one game where anybody can beat anybody because it's a limited card pool and there are RNG factors. And by differentiating our deck and adding more versatility, we are allowed to separate ourselves from the pack. Invest in the best and you will be blessed. And I'm the best, so I'm ready to bring your best to an even better level. Thank you so much for watching. As always, if it's not the goo, it's got to go. Peace.
Ooh, is that indigo?